We are MythVision. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Today, your host, Derek Lambert, will be taking you on a little bit of an adventure. I figure, why not piggyback off of yesterday's show? I have James Stephen Valliant with me. How you doing, James?
Real well. How are you?
It's James Stevens Valliant. I keep saying Stephen. I've been doing that for a long time now, and I apologize.
Well, as long as it's consistent.
Right? As long as I'm consistently screwing your name up, it's okay, because then you know I'm doing it out of ignorance.
Right. Well, no, it's just a funky middle name, so it's my fault, or my parents' fault, not yours.
It's not a funky middle name. It's just a first name. That's all it is. It's just a second first name.
Right.
James, I figure why not dig into some of what we talked about pertaining to the historical Jesus or mythicism. And I think it'll be an interesting discussion because, number one, the angle that Tom Jump's taking is saying that people exist, people were crucified during this time. The most logical, and I guess Occam's razor would simply be, in the approach he's taking, would be that a guy named Jesus existed and was crucified. And I get it. I get the position he's taking, and I respect it. It's more of a minimal historicist position, though, because most of the stuff he admits is myth, is literary, is theological. It's not concrete. But I want to probe with you so we can go back and forth in this. I think it's important because from what I'm understanding, even Dr. Ehrman is saying that the story of the crucifixion, death, burial, resurrection is part of the legend as well. However, he still thinks that there was a guy that was crucified, but even they mythologized that. And this is where I think it gets complicated. Because really it's all based off of, we can't really know for certain, but it's based off of a text that's literally mythologized. What can we know? What are your thoughts?
Well, that is the problem, that even the best historicists that are out there, like Bart Ehrman, and standard scholars who accept basic historicity to a Jesus, have to admit that the Gospel's presentation, that Paul's Jesus is mythologized, is not as described. That is to say, the earliest Christian literature that we have is not an accurate historical depiction. It has been tampered with, it has been edited, it has been redacted, it has been filtered through theological motives, and that's the very, very most best they can do. And so the struggle has been to sort through which bits of the Gospels. For example, we know, many of the stories of Jesus is enacting ritual. We know that some of what is said there was liturgical in origin. So when Jesus is being baptized, or when Jesus goes through the Last Supper, those are events that have been heavily filtered through the rituals that Christians themselves engaged in, initiation ritual like baptism or something. And much of his life is miraculous and legendary. Much of it appears to be based on Hebrew scriptures and reworked Hebrew scriptures, sometimes wrongly or mistranslated Hebrew scriptures that have been reworked into the life of Jesus. And if we sort through all that, then of course becomes the question of finding the historical Jesus. And for the last 200 years, since critical biblical scholarship has begun, the search for the historical Jesus under the mythologized rubble has been the question. All critical scholars recognize that we have a layer of mythologized Jesus on top that we're presented with and that we start with. And so we have to infer, we have to logically try and figure out what could be true about a real Jesus underneath. And so we've had the spectacle of various lives of Jesus, various, this is the real Jesus who's underneath it all. And the Jesus Seminar, for example, a couple of decades ago, tried to get a bunch of standard scholars together, sort through it all, and just go through the sayings of Jesus. And, for example, because we know most of the narrative material is mythology and can be demonstrated to be mythology, sometimes worked around the saying. For example, the saying came first, and then we know the narrative structure that, say, Luke gives to a saying is Luke's construction or someone else's construction afterwards. So just sorting through the sayings of Jesus, however, is problematic, because much of what critical scholars have come to learn is that the sayings attributed to Jesus have also been heavily edited, redacted, at the very least, if not wholly composed by some later generation. One of my favorite examples is, take up your own cross and follow me. Now, this was presumably said by Jesus before his crucifixion. Would he have been understood by any of his followers to have made any sense if he's not only predicting his execution, but the form of his execution? He's not only predicting that, but predicting that others will be persecuted for being Christian. So it would have been gibberish to his hearers. They would not have understood, had even Jesus miraculously predicted his own execution, how would his listeners have understood, pick up your own cross? In fact, if you think about it, the statement, pick up your own cross, has already got a symbolic, abstract understanding of the crucifixion built into it. So whatever your cross happens to be, pick it up and follow me. So it's not only understanding the crucifixion, but understanding a symbolic understanding, an allegorical understanding of the crucifixion. So a statement like that is almost certainly composed by someone other than Jesus and put into the mouth of Jesus at a later time. So, and even when we come down to some of the more basic things Jesus said, there's variations between Luke and Matthew, for example, on the same, riffing on the same basic idea. Blessed are the poor, or blessed are the poor in spirit. Now, if you believe Jesus said both slightly different things on two different occasions, or is it more likely at least one of our gospel authors has taken liberties with the original source that he had to work with? Given that, we have to sort through the rubble. The rubble being the mythologization of Jesus that is clearly layered on top and on top and on top of, if there even is a historical Jesus, this historical Jesus. So the question is there a historical Jesus underneath all that rubble? And can we do the excavation required to get at what a historical Jesus must have said or looked like? And
James,
that is...
You bring up a very fascinating point. And I must say to our audience, if you haven't read Creating Christ, you need to, because Dr. Bob, who's a fan favorite on this channel, I just tried to call him before I actually contacted you to touch base and schedule in another show. So be
at least you got
tuned,
your priorities straight. Yeah, go to Dr. Bob first.
Well, in terms of this,
I agree.
That's why, I mean, like, this subject, obviously, if you want to really hear a skeptic and a myth, someone who's a mythicist who says, look,
right,
I don't have good reason to say this guy for sure. He doesn't deny there could have been. He says of your book that of all books that he's read on the subject, that your position and how you guys show your evidence in your book has brought him closest to the best understanding of the pre-mythologized Jesus he can try and understand. And I mean, these are not verbatim what he said. This is the concept, is that if there was a Jesus, this is the closest to one that he could think, if there was one, it's based off of. And that was a rebel. And so I want to talk about this based off of the last show I did with Tom Jump. And Tom's a brilliant guy. If you listen to the show, you can tell he's well-versed in understanding a lot of things. And he's just taking what's basic. And he used Hercules as an example. And he says, well, it sounded like he took a euhemerus position, though. He says, you know, do you think that this guy was whole concocted up from imagination and made up? Or was this based off of a guy at some point? And that's euhemerus. So what do you think? Do you think, and I know it doesn't mean, like, there's no absolutes in this. This is all probability and everything that we can do to try and figure it out. Do you think it's more likely there was a guy who was mythologized, like the Bart Ehrmans of the world, the Dr. Ehrman and the historicist? Or do you think it's just as likely that this is a Roman propaganda or even a Jewish Roman propaganda that is trying to explain why their temple, why their system, why everything needed to stop, This old way needed to end. It was going to destroy their people, and they had to find a scapegoat or create one and say, this guy, this back here is the reason why this happened to you. And this is why it's written post 70. And in my opinion, if you take that approach, I had to ask Tom a question. I'm probing while I ask you this to see what you think, because you're well thought. You articulate well. Okay, if there was a guy, I said, Tom, did they pick a nobody that nobody cared to talk about? I mean, look at Judah of Galilee, right? Judah was spoken of. He was a rebel badass. You cannot forget about him. And then he says, no, but I think there is mentions of Jesus and Josephus, but it's so slim and so little. Why pick this guy Jesus if this guy is being mentioned in Josephus? Suppose, and let's suppose it's not interpolation, as
Right.
mythicists espouse. If they did pick him, why? Could they just create him what they wanted him to be? Is he a nobody? And he says, yes, that's the reason why they would pick him. Now, that's guessing work. That's just supposing. But what are your thoughts? Why do they pick Jesus if there was one?
Well, a lot will depend on how we date the documents, in my view. If we have Christian documents written in the 1st century, which I believe we do have, and if there was some mention of Jesus in Josephus in the 1st century, which I also believe we do have. I believe that the testimonium is heavily tampered with in Josephus, but I think it's impossible to get away from the other mention of Jesus in relation to James. And that suggests to me that Jesus was mentioned, and that the second mention was terrifically augmented by Eusebius students in the 4th century, in the early 4th century, which I think it certainly was. But if we have 1st century material talking about a Jesus, then we have a very interesting problem, because he must have been a relatively empty vessel for him to be, a Christmas tree to have so many decorations put upon. In other words, if they could put words into the mouth of Jesus so freely, pick up your own cross and follow me, then his teachings could not have been so well understood that there was this Jesus fellow that, oh no, Jesus didn't say that. Jesus said nothing like that, because it's still within living memory if it's within the 1st century. There were people still around who would have remembered who this Jesus was, and yet we can add nativity stories, if you're Matthew or Luke, that are totally independent of one another, appear to have nothing to do with one another, and appear to be fully based on Hebrew literature. And we could attach those nativity stories, here we are around Christmas time, we could attach those nativity stories to the life of Jesus without fear of contradiction. We could retell the story of Jesus in various, even contradictory ways, without any fear of contradiction. We could have a John tradition that says he was crucified on one day relative to Passover, and we could have a synoptic tradition that says he was crucified on another day, and we can take our liberties. We could even insert, as I say, words into the mouth of Jesus within the 1st century to this character who would have existed within living memory. That is a huge problem in my view, that has not been adequately addressed in the historicism, mythicism debate. He had to be a relatively empty vessel.
So either he's a relatively...
if they'd said Judas the Galilean, for example, everyone would have known.
Yeah.
We know what Judas the Galilean believed. He was anti-tax. He never said render unto Caesar. He never said blessed are the peacemakers. He never said turn the other cheek. Judas the Galilean, like you point out, was a kick-ass rebel who would never have said such things. In fact, said the exact opposite. Must have said the exact opposite.
So James, just to kind of I like this. We're stimulating thought here. To kind of go, either he was an empty vessel or he was created, in my opinion, because it's like, and I'm not saying that, look, honestly, I seriously have no bone to pick. I really I don't care at the end of the day. If the guy did exist, he's just a mythologized person at that point. And he's just probably a good example of how anyone can become a hero figure in history.
Well, let's back up. Let's back up a little. You made an interesting connection with Hercules or Heracles.
Yes.
Well-known mythological figure. Was there a historical Hercules. We go back to the Greek Heracles, upon whom he is based, someone who's mentioned, for example, by Homer in the Iliad. But he's mentioned in a highly mythologized way, even in our earliest notices of him.
Right.
He does fantastic deeds. He slays terrible monsters. He himself suffers a martyrdom and an apotheosis, becoming a god, being born of a god and a mortal woman. He suffers on earth, does his 12 labors, and dies a horrible death, but then becomes a god. So in one sense, he has a life that's very much like Jesus's, but was there a historical Hercules? Now there's a really good question. In most cases, I believe, when we're talking about these demigod, heroic figures, we're probably talking about at least one historical figure many centuries ago, who probably, the stories about whom probably got the whole thing underway and got things churning. Now, the name Heracles itself is kind of suspicious, the glory of Hera, the goddess Hera, who turns out in the story of Heracles to be his great nemesis, the goddess who sends him on his 12 labors and who's constantly making him do all these terrible things, who in the end he has to be reconciled with. So his name is even suspicious.
Good point.
But then Jesus's name is kind of suspicious too.
Depends on how you want to take this, and that's what I told Tom. And someone commented on the video. It was actually very funny. I'm gonna have to pull it up while we do this so you can hear what this person said. But yes, like the name Jesus, the way it's formulated in the gospel narrative, at least in terms of his birth narrative, the angel tells Joseph, his name shall be called Jesus, and that's it? No. For he shall save his people from their sins. So this is the reason they're naming him Jesus, according to the narrative in the gospel.
It's built into the narrative.
It's built in his purpose is in the name. Right.
It's also the name of the very first Messiah in Hebrew scripture, if you will, the successor of Moses. And Moses actually changed the name of Hosea to Yeshua, which became Jesus, because he would be the salvation of the people, God's salvation for the people. And it was given that name even in Hebrew scripture. So although it was a very common name for Jews to have in the first century, it is a messianically evocative name. Take for example the ancient Romans. They began, a lot of scholars believe, as ancestor worshipers. And so their gods, like Jupiter and Juno, the names at least of their gods that became identified with other foreign gods, that was the Roman way, probably were ancestors, ancestor kings, priests,
right,
that existed at the very big dawn, perhaps, of the Latin or Sabine or Etruscan people. There were names of these people, and these ancestors were worshipped and then suddenly became the ancestors of the whole people, the ancestor gods, if you will. And so there may well have been historical figures who lie underneath the rubble of Juno and Jupiter and Hercules and all the others. Indeed, when we have events like, say, the Trojan War, which we know were actually historic events in prehistoric Bronze Age times, do I think there was an Achilles? Do I think there was a Hector who fought out? I think there may well have been historical figures who fought out a Trojan War in the Bronze Age. I think that there's enough archaeological evidence to support that, and that an oral tradition preserved at least a fragment, a nugget of their historicity through the centuries to be written down later into the Iliad, the story of the Trojan War. But the story of the Trojan War also tells us that Achilles was the son of a goddess, and that gods and goddesses came down and fought beside the heroes of the Trojan War, and that Athena inspired heroes and actually guided spears that they tossed. Now, do I believe that Athena, the goddess of wisdom and warfare, came down and inspired and helped Achilles during the war? No, I do not.
Right.
I believe Iliad is highly mythologized, even though there may have been a Trojan War that contained characters somewhat based on that, or at least one Trojan War, maybe more than one Trojan War got conflated. This is the problem that we have. Now, with Jesus, we have a particularly aggravated situation because they're not preserving an oral tradition, say, that may have been corrupted over the centuries. Because if something is preserved in a purely oral tradition and over time begins to develop mythologized qualities, supernatural, miraculous qualities, as the heroes of Greek and Roman mythology do, or become identified with other gods. Let's identify the Roman god Jupiter with the Greek god Zeus, and they're really fundamentally the same thing. That happens at a later stage. Well, that fusion is obviously artificial, whether or not there's a Jupiter who underlies it all, centuries earlier in Roman history. The same is true in spades for Jesus. Jesus is said to have lived in historical times. This is not a prehistoric legend like Hercules or Jupiter or Achilles that was preserved in an oral tradition for centuries, mythologized probably that tradition, and then finally set down, and the writing itself was set down as a preserved oral tradition of centuries. No. Jesus is said to have lived in historical times when people wrote history and wrote contemporary documents. This presents a unique problem for the historicity of Jesus, because we have good evidence for people who lived at the time, indeed before the time of Jesus, centuries before the time of Jesus. We have good, solid evidence that they existed. Contemporary records, archaeological evidence, coins that were struck with images of these people on them, buildings that were constructed by some of these people, and histories that were written perhaps shortly after their lives, but that are clearly based on contemporary records that came earlier. This is not the case with Jesus. Jesus lived in historical times, but the very first mentions of him in any literature that we possess happened decades after his life and are themselves clearly heavily mythologized and clearly based on other things.
Right.
Hebrew prophecies, for example, of what the Messiah should be like, and other pagan deities who were dying, resurrected savior gods. If Jesus is a fusion of these elements, then it is a fair question, I think, to ask, could Jesus be totally hatched? That is to say, merely a combination of all of these various elements. Since it occurs in historical times, and indeed the Gospels were written in a time when the Romans were busy fusing every foreign god into one giant international amalgam, if you will, at this very moment, could Jesus have been just one of these amalgamations that the Romans were actively engaged in fusing together? In fact, we know centuries before Jesus, 3 centuries before Jesus, Ptolemy I sort of created a god who was himself a fusion, Serapis, a fusion of certain Greek gods and certain Egyptian gods. Osiris, the god of the afterlife, who himself had suffered a terrible martyrdom death, only to become the god of the afterlife, being put together again by his wife Isis, is being fused with certain Greek gods, such as Asclepius or Apollo or Hades. And when those gods are being fused together to create this Serapis, this new god, no one would suggest that Serapis is a real historical being. He is himself a fusion in his very origin, a sort of taking of types, a symbolic representation of general forms, and putting them together into a new, unique form. So even if there may have been, underneath all the rubble, an Asclepius, let's say, the Greek god of healing, or even if there may have been some ancestor of the ancient Egyptians that got the Osiris story going,
right?
We have 2 heavily mythologized figures who may have been based on history, right? Asclepius and Osiris, heavily mythologized over many, many centuries into gods, themselves being fused into yet a new god, Serapis. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to say, if you ask me, was there a historical Serapis or Serapis? Does it? No, he was a fusion of 2 previous gods. Themselves, if they were based on real people, are very, very, very ancient people filtered through centuries of oral tradition and mythologization.
So it's fair to even say that if they did exist, just using those analogies of the gods that eventually down the road create Serapis, it's fair to say that the perception of them by the time Serapis is coming on the scene to even be invented is not even viewed as a man may have existed, but a god. So maybe they've
Correct.
lost the sense of a humanity of anyone that may have existed prior to. Now, let me ask you this about the Greeks. Let's go, because obviously Serapis is coming on the scene out of Greco-Roman, or really Greek, the Greek world.
Greco-Egyptian.
Greco-Egyptian. So let me ask you
Right.
this about the Greeks. I know Euhemerus has mentioned that these are rooted in ancient ancestors, and they did ancestry worship. I mean, this is something known from the Romans, at least, was ancestry worship. And so, do you think, did they all think, was it a common thing in the Greek world to see the gods as like, hey, that was my great, 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 great grandpa?
Oh, the original layer of Greek mythology is designed just to do that. And in fact, the heroes of mythology are the ancestors of the Greek kings that come into historical times. In other words, I am just a descendant. In fact, for example, just to take a good example, the kings of Epirus in Western Greece, a kingdom on the west Adriatic Sea on the west coast of Greece, basically a Greek kingdom. Alexander the Great's mother was a princess from Epirus. They regarded themselves as descendants of Achilles, the great hero of the Iliad. And to give their own kings legitimacy, they were themselves descendants of these gods. Many Greek kings regarded themselves as descendants of, we just mentioned him, Hercules, the Greek form Heracles. Heracles was my ancestor. And so when you get to the Roman times, it's very interesting because they're actually engaged in philosophical analysis and speculation as to the origins of these gods. Many Greek and Roman writers by Roman times will say, where are these gods coming from? Were they historical figures? Have they just been mythologized? Are these stories? In fact, we'll hear historians say, well, you know how stories get exaggerated over time. Well, I'll just tell you the stories that we've received. And they'll tell it to us just like that. So they're self-consciously aware of how stories get exaggerated. They're self-consciously aware of the fact that maybe these are distant ancestors of ours who have been heavily mythologized. But the legitimacy of many Greek kings was very much based on their descent from these gods or these heroes from mythology. The Romans followed suit. The first dynasty of Roman emperors claimed to be descendants of Aeneas, a hero from Homer's Iliad, who was on the Trojan side and the son of the goddess Aphrodite, the goddess of love. And so the Caesars themselves claimed to be descendants of Greek gods that were identified with Roman gods, Venus, Aphrodite, for example, in order to enhance their own legitimacy. So the interrelationship between ancestor worship and the legitimacy of the governments themselves was very closely connected at this time. But we're also living in a time where people are philosophically considering that subject self-consciously. Are these mythologized figures? Are these truly historical ancestors of people that we've mythologized over time? And that is exactly the way historians, say like Plutarch, the Greek historian from the late 1st century, are looking at these legendary figures.
So, James, you spark an interest. I want to point at Jesus here. And of course, Gospels come later. Okay, I just don't see even Mark playing its source prior to 70. I just don't see even Mark playing a role prior to the temple's demise. That's just my opinion. Now, could someone have interpolated anything that's relevant to the temple's destruction into it? Maybe, but let's go with what most critical scholars say, and let's say, hey, Gospels are after, Paul's before, at least 7 of the 13. Now, this Jesus character in the gospel narrative has genealogy. They're rooting him back, similar to how
two different contradictory genealogies.
Right.
They trace Joseph, his mortal father, who's never really his biological father. They trace his ancestry back to David. They have a different number of generations and a different list of names following David. So there's, yes, we're given genealogies of Jesus by Matthew and Luke, but 2 quite contradictory ones.
Right. So you can't, I mean, like, what do you do with that?
Some people try to figure, well, one must be the genealogy of Mary and one must be the genealogy of Joseph, even though They're both genealogies of Joseph on the face of it.
Right, right. Okay, okay. So let's dig on Jesus here. Jesus doesn't seem to have that same ancestral worship in the same way the Greeks do. However, he keeps rooting back to the prophets, rooting back to the fathers, Abraham. He in many ways is reaching back, to these supposed people. And
Well, the Messiah must come from the tribe of Judah and from the line of David. Hebrew scripture had promised repeatedly that the throne, the kingdom, shall never be taken away from Judah. Indeed, God promised to David that his descendants will forever rule. This created a tradition in messianic Jewish prophecy that the Messiah should be from the line of David.
So, in light of the creation of Serapis, for example, and here with Jesus, do you think something similar is going on here, except taking a rebel, or at least the notion of a rebel, okay, even if there wasn't a guy necessarily, just like Serapis isn't a guy necessarily, could they be taking from the rebels and saying, let's take Caesar and let's take a rebel and let's create a baby and call it Jesus? Do you think that could be something that's going on? Or do you think being Paul's taking place in the 50s, which I don't know if this plays any weight on this idea, but Paul's Jesus, whatever that is, do you think he had the same idea of a Romanized type Jew? What are your thoughts on that?
I think there's no question that Paul was heavily influenced by Hellenic ideas, Hellenized philosophy, the notion of a man God, the notion of mysteries. I think a lot of that plays right into the themes of Paul. A resurrected man God is a pagan element in itself. In fact, a very anti-Jewish element. And Paul is clearly talking about a man God, a resurrected man God, and the mysteries of a resurrected man God, which is very contemporary. And if you go to Paul's time, that is standard Greco-Roman religion. That is one of the base formula, if you will, for a contemporary religion at the time Paul is first writing the earliest Christian literature. And so I think there's very little doubt that Paul himself is keying off of pagan religious elements. And that's not historical. On the other hand, Paul, maybe ambiguously, but Paul repeatedly suggests that Jesus was, in fact, a real person born. If that's the case, then what we have is a contradiction. I mentioned the biographies of Plutarch from the late first century. There's no question that the Gospels are imitating sort of classical biography in their form. They're telling us the life of this man, Jesus. And as ancient biographies go, they stand out in terms of how highly mythologized they are, but ancient biographies often contain supernatural and mythologized elements about these figures. Plutarch will sometimes report, especially about the more ancient, his famous work, Parallel Lives, where he compares two different figures, are really some of the finest biography from the ancient world, and they are specifically biographies. Suetonius, a Roman writer writing in the 2nd century, was also a biographer. He wrote biographies of the first Caesars. Right. And he will tell stories that are miraculous signs and wondrous prodigies about the emperors that show divine favor to these various figures. He'll tell the stories in a way like Plutarch will. If you want to believe it, this is what was told. And one of the things he'll say, for example, about Vespasian is that Vespasian, and he'll say it point blank, Vespasian was the true Messiah. He was the fulfillment of Hebrew prophecy. He did perform healing miracles at the Serapeum, the temple of Serapis in Alexandria in Egypt. So miraculous deeds are being told in ancient biographies of real historical figures. Mm-hmm. And the Gospels appear to be keying off of the same sort of form, ancient biography, only they are, like Suetonius, are taking certain of the mythologized elements very, very seriously and presenting it as history.
Okay. You let me read you something that someone actually commented on the last video with Tom Jump, and I want to take us here. Tom was saying people exist, people were crucified. It's more likely that a guy was crucified named Jesus than there wasn't a guy who was crucified. And I think you made a quick reference but didn't dig by saying secondary sources, right? So we didn't go there. We weren't talking about these sources, but one guy wrote, and I thought it was pretty interesting. He says, well, Hercules was placed on a bonfire, and we know bonfires are a real thing that the ancients did, and some do to this day. So Hercules was a historical figure. So he's saying, I guess, because there's things that actually happened during times, like in the first century, crucifixion was known and common. Therefore, because that was something that did happen often, therefore this event happened.
Let's do him one better. Let's do him one better.
Okay.
Hundreds of Jesuses were crucified in the first century.
Okay.
As a fact.
Right.
We know as a fact, a bunch of dudes named Jesus were crucified in the first and second centuries.
Okay.
That is, or the first century BC.
Right.
You want to pick from among them? In other words, what we need is more than a dude named Jesus who was crucified. We need that dude named Jesus who was crucified was the inspiration for these stories. Which of the Jesuses, of the hundreds of Jesuses who were crucified in the first century, could that be? Pick one. Were there dudes who claimed to be Messiah who were crucified in the first century? Oh yeah.
This is the direction that I was trying to take this conversation.
Lots of pretended messiahs were crucified. I'll bet you that there were pretended messiahs named Jesus who were crucified in the first century. That's just a question of odds.
And that's where you're bringing up a good point here, James. And I want to narrow, since you connected the dots that I was wanting to try and get to, even though everything else is very informative, and it makes you kind of wonder, historicism is plausible. It's not that it's not possible, it's plausible. However, let's take a skeptical approach to this, like what you're doing here. And you're saying, look, there were lots of Jesuses. Which one, right? Well, here's my question. Let's go with what we have, right? You have to work with what we have, what we're using. And using the New Testament is pretty much where we're going with this at this moment. Let's do what the Gospels do. I mean, hey, this is what we're reading, right? Let's go with the Gospels for a second here. I know Paul doesn't mention Pontius Pilate, but supposedly this Jesus has to fit within this Pontius Pilate. So now we've got something.
That is a historical hook, isn't it?
It is.
That's a historical hook. They say he was executed when Pontius Pilate was governor.
Mm-hmm.
Ooh, okay, there's a specific historical hook. So whoever this Jesus is, if there was a historical Jesus, he was crucified. His name was Jesus, and it happened during the governorship of Pontius Pilate, presumably during the reign of the Emperor Tiberius.
And this is the problem. I don't know, okay? I'm throwing it out there. I'm going to mention it like I did on with Tom, okay? And I want your thoughts. I think, and I could be mistaken, unless there's a political gain for why Pontius Pilate's mentioned in this part here, that this still could be fabricated in the placing of him in this time frame. And when you look at the narrative, I looked at this text and said, hey, this is theological. It's fabricated theology is what it is, based off Old Testament story. When you see that, at what point is I'm going to call the meat the theology, and the bone is what's really the history, okay? Let's suppose the bone is history. We're peeling away layers of meat, okay? As I'm reading Joseph in the Old Testament, and he's sold by his brother Judas, okay, there's some meat, okay? And you start seeing 30 pieces of meat. Let's get rid of the meat. Okay, so that's probably not literally true. I'm going to say if it's repeated from the Old Testament narrative, it probably didn't literally historically happen.
Right. So if we have a Judah who's one of a 12, who's betraying someone for 30 pieces of silver,
right?
You're suspicious that nothing like that happened to our first century Jesus.
At all. And I'm not saying, and look, I'm not trying to throw stones at believers, because they might go, see, that's the thing. You're missing the miracle of it.
Right. Okay. It's a fulfillment of this promise, the implicit promise, even though that story wasn't messianic and by necessity.
Right.
By reliving this, you're missing the fulfillment.
That's what they're saying. I'm saying I'm past that, in my opinion. I'm
Mm-hmm.
saying let's look at this as literature, okay? Let's stop trying to get hocus pocus, because you don't do the same
Right.
thing with the writings of
See,
Hercules. You don't do the same thing with
exactly.
Serapis. You're not
If
doing
it
it with.
was just one thing,
Mm-hmm.
right? If it was just one piece of Hebrew literature that was lifted, then you might say, okay, it was some kind of fulfillment.
Right.
But we're seeing it linguistically. The very language of Hebrew scripture is sometimes being found in the New Testament. When Elizabeth and Mary are told that they would give miraculous birth, each praises their situation in just the same fashion that Hannah does when she's told of her miraculous birth, the miraculous birth of the prophet Samuel in Hebrew scriptures. Or if Joseph has prophetic dreams that lead the Holy Family to Egypt, the prophetic dreams of Joseph in Genesis in Egypt are to be ignored. Or if we have a slaughter of the babies by Herod and Matthew, and we have a slaughter of the babies at the time of Moses,
Right.
it's over and over. And if Jonah was in the belly of the whale for 3 days, and if Jesus, represented by a fish, is resurrected in 3 days,
Right.
never mind all those parallels. The fact that there are parallel after parallel after parallel, I think is correct. Your logic, in other words, is correct. We have to begin to see this as the Hebrew scriptures being reworked intentionally into someone's life. Not a miraculous fulfillment, but an actual linguistic lifting.
Right, right. So let's probe with that. Let's probe for a second into the meat, the theology, the linguistics of old to new. And I want your opinion on this. Maybe you can tell me something I'm missing on the Roman side, because you're a big expert on the Roman things and knowing about the Romans. So Joseph sold off. They get their silver. Judah does it, and then the brothers are on board. They sell him to the Amalekites, I believe. The Amalekites take him to Egypt. Okay. He ends up in Potiphar's house. And this is where it's fascinating. The details change, okay? In Potiphar's house, he's to be trusted. All right, he's in charge of everything Potiphar owns except his wife. Well, he gets accused. He's being falsely accused, okay? Whereas in the New Testament, it's apparent that he's in Pontius Pilate's house at this point, okay? And I'm looking at the narrative. I'm trying to see the narrative, linguistic narrative parallel here, and I'm saying, did this really even happen at all? Did this guy really end up in this house? Was Pontius Pilate really wasting his time going, okay, Mr. Master of Truth, what is truth? Okay, I don't even think this conversation's ever happened. And I think a lot of skeptics would say, yeah, that was fabricated. But nonetheless, Pontius Pilate crucified this guy named Jesus. Okay, how do you know that? But nonetheless, let's pause for a second. I like this idea. Potiphar, Pontius Pilate, okay, both are like important people to their government. Potiphar's important to Egypt. Pontius Pilate, Dirk, that's parallel mania. Well, call it what you want. It seems like he fits a narrative that is needed to copy Joseph's story in history, to try and copy Joseph's story and create a recreation of this narrative leading up to a cataclysmic event. So
coming back to what you said before, an explanation for the Jewish defeat at the hands of the Romans in the first century. As monotheists, we need, just as the original captivity and the conquest by Babylonians, right, back in the 6th century BC,
right,
has to be explained by the decadence of the Jewish people. So, how did we sin that we were so punished? So the Romans' conquest of Judea in the 1st century, as you said earlier in the interview, would require an explanation. Therefore, the idea of the true Messiah was somehow betrayed. There's
right.
been a betrayal of the true understanding.
Joseph,
right?
Joseph, it's literary. So, and when you see that, trying to get me to come back to the methodology that's commonly used by historians is very difficult for me to do. And I'm not trying to be biased, but
and what was Joseph doing in Egypt too? He would eventually save the Jewish people from famine, right?
Right.
And he's surviving in a foreign culture.
Not
And
only
isn't that a
that,
giant metaphor? Isn't that a giant metaphor for the 1st century?
it is.
We Jews now in a foreign culture will have to survive and be saved from destruction, in effect. We even have in the historian Josephus an echo
right
of a Joseph who goes over to the foreigners and saves his people.
So let's probe into the story narrative, copying it back to the new, and bring up your point, because that's the conclusion that I'm seeing. Whoever's reading this is a clever son of a gun, dude. Because, or whoever's writing this is clever, because you have him being kicked out of Potiphar's house, and it's quite interesting to me that Pontius Pilate even kicks Jesus out. Go to Herod. Herod brings him back, and he's innocent. And then he's left with no choice but to accuse and throw him into the pit, or have him killed,
Right.
have him put in the grave, or in the dungeon as Joseph was. And next thing you know, he's in charge of the damn dungeon. Joseph's in charge of the dungeon. Well, Jesus, does he not have the keys of death and hell? Does he not go down into the pit? Does he not go into Abraham's bosom according to the tell, and he sets the captives free? Well, Joseph goes down. Two guys have a dream. Baker, wine bearer. This is my blood. This is my flesh. Eat of my blood and my flesh. And he says, do this in remembrance of me. The baker's killed. The wine bearer's back up into, Pharaoh's right-hand man, giving him wine. And he says, don't forget me, man. Jesus says, do this in remembrance of me, man. And he ends up there with Pharaoh, and Pharaoh has
echoes of Hebrew scripture
over and over. And then that's where Josephus plays a funny role, in my opinion. Josephus plays a very, very funny role. And I know this is conspiratorial, okay? And that's okay to speculate. I don't know. I could be freaking wrong all day about this, but I think it's interesting. Joseph, is predicting the dream of Pharaoh, or may I say the emperor of Rome, okay? And he is literally trying to save his people. He went from a rebel over to a pro-Roman who sang "Come to Egypt." They didn't recognize him, so to speak. It just, to me, there seems to be
we obviously
connected.
got the idea of Messiah. Well, our ancient sources are all very consistent, and it makes good sense. It was messianic prophecies, according to Tacitus, Suetonius, Josephus, all of the ancient historians, Jewish or pagan, who write about the subject, say it was messianic prophecies that most motivated the Jewish war of the first century. Indeed,
right.
The first 2 centuries of both wars. It's clearly messianic in nature. So fundamentally, what has gone wrong is we got the idea of Messiah wrong somehow. It is our understanding of messianic prophecies that screwed us up, that motivated this war, and it was our misunderstanding of that that somehow led to our disaster. So if we have to explain the Jewish defeat at the hands of the Romans in the first century, the answer to this question must be found in a misunderstanding of the concept of Messiah. It must be the predicate, right? And so whatever we understand about Messiah has to have been wrong. We got it wrong somehow about Messiah. Josephus says that, and in his own autobiography, in his own telling of his own story, he says God, the Jewish God, has gone over to the Roman side. And so when he makes his prayer, when he says he's going over to the Romans, let me be a good, faithful messenger for you, God, because obviously you've gone over to the Roman side. I will tell the Romans how the Jewish God has gone over to their side. The Gospels, in effect, are saying the same thing. Mm-hmm. In fact, Paul is saying the same thing in Romans 13, right? Obey the state as God's appointed agents on earth. In effect, Paul is saying God has gone over to the Roman side. Jesus, when he praises the centurion, is in effect saying God has gone over to the Roman side. So they echo, Josephus's own motivation here is echoed in the same sort of message that's being delivered in the New Testament.
Right.
God has gone over to the Roman side, and we have fundamentally misunderstood Messiah. Josephus goes so far as to say that the Messiah is Vespasian, the Roman conqueror of the Jews. And that, I believe, is implicitly found in the Gospels as well, with the parallels between the Flavians and Jesus. Jesus' predicted timing of the glorious coming of the Son of Man in synoptics. So I think there's good reason to connect the two. But
isn't it fair to say that Joseph and the Pharaoh were both co-messiahs in the Joseph story? I mean, if Pharaoh didn't trust in Joseph, if Joseph did not trust in what God had done by placing him in Pharaoh's household, is this not a way of trying to somehow co-opt the Messiah concept here in this Old Testament story? I mean,
there does seem to be a direct parallel, doesn't? Instead of a famine, which we have in Genesis that saves Jacob's children, we have the Jewish war. But we have a crisis nonetheless, right? And both are saving their people and using a foreign emperor, in effect, to help save their people. And you can really see it in Josephus's own statement about his own life, how he found a new life under the Romans. And that's sort of a model that he's presenting. Look, if we get along and go along, everything will be just ducky and we can still be good Jews. So there is a definite parallel of Josephus and a foreign emperor, prophetic dreams at a time of crisis that saves all of Israel.
Now, someone might say, well, guys, I get it. That's all theology. Duh. That still doesn't discount that a man named Jesus died at the hands of Pontius Pilate back in the 30s AD. What do you think about that, and how would you answer that idea?
Well, we can go better than that. In other words, there are some things we can deduce about a historical Jesus, in my view, that would be true of a historical Jesus if he existed.
Let's do it. I want to hear. Take me there.
In this regard, I believe that Paul's letter to the Galatians is sort of a Rosetta Stone. It really is. There's other parts of the New Testament that reflect this argument, but Galatians is our best source from the mouth of a New Testament Christian about conflict within the messianic Jewish movement. Paul makes it very plain in Galatians that the previous apostles, the Christians who came before him, were Torah orthodox. They are not eating with Gentiles. They believe in circumcision. They believe in adhering strictly to the Torah. Paul, in making his argument in Galatians and elsewhere, says that I did not get my own anti-Torah message. Paul famously criticizes circumcision, famously criticizes kosher diet. In fact, famously reorients everyone with respect to the Jewish law. We no longer have to adhere to Torah in certain respects. We are free in Christ, to use Paul's phrase that he uses repeatedly throughout his writings. We are free from the law thanks to the death and resurrection of Jesus, is the argument of Paul. And Paul insists that he did not get this message from anyone else. He got it from no man, but directly from his own revelation of Jesus Christ. He insists on that over and over again. And we see in Galatians a heated argument where he has to confront Cephas to his face over Cephas's own hypocrisy. And he talks about James, who's apparently the leader of the apostles before Paul, who's spying out his freedom in Christ, doesn't like his freedom in Christ.
Right.
And somehow trying to enforce Torah on Paul and Paul's followers. This makes it clear to me that Paul was the author of the anti-Torah aspects of the New Testament, and that Paul is the originator of it. Paul, in his own visions, came up with it. Paul did not get it from previous Christians. It is not something that is original to Jesus. So anytime in the Gospels we see Jesus behaving in an anti-Torah, pro-Pauline way in this way, I believe it is an effort to demonstrate Paul's side of the argument as being correct, to give the authority of Paul's side straight from the mouth of Jesus, if you will. If Jesus says nothing we put into our body is polluted, it's only what comes out of our body that defiles, then he's attacking head-on kosher diet in a way that is not credible for any Christian prior to Paul. In other words, I'm convinced that if there was a historical Jesus, like all the apostles that Paul was confronting to their face, or all the previous apostles who felt it necessary to spy out Paul's freedom in Christ, Jesus, if there was a historical Jesus, was Torah orthodox, like all the first Christians were before Paul. And if that's true, what else has been changed about Jesus? Stop right there, though.
Okay.
If there was a historical Jesus, the Gospels have completely turned him upside down and inside out. They've presented Jesus as someone who attacks the purity laws, as someone who doesn't mind when his disciples work on the Sabbath, someone who doesn't mind cavorting with polluted people, someone who doesn't mind in any number of ways violating Jewish purity laws. We're talking about someone who praises Romans, befriends tax collectors, says prostitutes will get into heaven before the priests will. So this is someone who's directly confronting contemporary Jewish ethics, and it is not a credible portrait in my mind. That person, the Jesus of the Gospels, who is a critic of contemporary Jewish ethics, is a post-Pauline construction. And in fact, if there was a historical Jesus, this Jesus was just exactly the opposite on such matters.
Right. So I think that that's a good point. I mean, if there was a guy, that's what Dr. Price is saying. He definitely is saying that you guys come very close to Brandon's idea. But I want to ask you a question.
Well, Brandon would say that this is actually a rebel Jesus.
Right, right. Do you not agree that, or?
Well, let me put it this way. If there was a Jesus, if there was a historical Jesus, he was not crucified by Pontius Pilate for saying, pay your taxes and love your enemies, turn the other cheek, and for praising centurions.
Right.
If there was a historical Jesus, he was much more likely to have been crucified for being a rebel.
Okay.
Right.
So in light of that, do you, and Tom brought this up, and I'm just kind of bringing up points on the last show. We're kind of piggybacking off of it. He says, yeah, what would be the point of them putting a stone in front of the grave and then having guards with a stamp and a seal, whatever? It's like, why would you do that? Is that just part of the hocus pocus of it? I mean, is this like, the idea is like, how's he going to get out? That's the whole idea. Or what do you think? I know that Dr. Ehrman used to think that was like somewhat true. And then he says that this body disappears. Well, I want to take you real quick into the resurrection because it's right there. Paul believed in a resurrection, whoever wrote Paul. Do you think there was a guy who actually died who may have rose again? I know this is speculation. I know there's so many ways you could take this. Do you think that a guy they really believed rose from the dead? Or do you think this could have been angelic? Or what do you think?
Okay. We've entered into some really complex things, because what is resurrection to the first century Jew? Josephus tells us, Philo tells us, right, that many Jews of the first century believed in resurrection. Not all of them. The Sadducees don't believe in a resurrection of the dead, we're told. But we're told that most Pharisees and most Essenes of the first century believed in some kind of resurrection of the dead. There's doctrines in the Gospels which suggest that some kind of reincarnation may have been expected. Was John the Baptist Elijah?
Right.
Should this be Elijah, come back from the dead somehow, reincarnate, at least in some sense reincarnated? So what do we mean by resurrection of the dead? Obviously, many first century Jews had some concept of the resurrection of the dead.
Right.
They may have had some vague concept, some of them, of a reincarnation, of the required reincarnation of Elijah as a presage of the coming of the Messiah.
They keep asking, are you Elijah? Like they
exactly.
were asking, like, now, is that part of the narrative, or is that and that I'm just saying it could be that it's part of the narrative.
We have a suggestion in Hebrew scriptures that Elijah needs to come back, that Elijah needs to be part of the messianic return.
Do we have anything outside of the New Testament that kind of gives us more information on what these people thought, like that Elijah needed to actually come back and stuff? Or
this is a very controversial. We're actually dealing with some very fragmentary evidence. Yeah, we are, and we're inferring some various things. And notice we have a variety of Jewish viewpoints on the topic of resurrection in the first century. But resurrection was itself a hot topic among Jews in the first century. That is why such a rigmarole about the resurrection of Jesus is itself suspicious.
Right.
Okay, because we're already talking about people who are keyed up on the concept of resurrection. So what does resurrection mean? Is it a new spiritual body that we get, a la Paul, or is it the same? Is it now the same physical? And notice the Egyptians themselves mummified their dead. So there's something important about preserving the body itself. So is this physical resurrection? And Bart Ehrman makes a huge point about how our pagan parallels aren't really parallels because they don't really involve a physical resurrection of the same body, the same body that doubting Thomas can touch in the Gospel of John. What kind of resurrection are we talking about? What do we mean by resurrection of the dead? And the Gospels are clearly wrestling with that whole topic. And they're using the hope of the devotee's own resurrection as a major motivator, right? Okay. So your resurrection, Derek, is what this is all about, right? Your afterlife is what this is all about. So we need a model, and this is the way the pagan resurrected gods work. They were semi-divine, usually born of a god, born of a mortal, suffered on earth, die, have a horrible martyrdom, but then enjoy an apotheosis to become a god. And that experience is the hope for the followers of this god for their afterlife. It's the resurrection of Asclepius, his apotheosis into being a god, his being able to bring people back from the dead, this healer god Asclepius, who gives his followers hope for their own afterlife. Since Christianity is offering afterlife as a hope, the entire resurrection story has to be looked at with a grain of salt. Did people believe there was a Jesus who was resurrected right there at that moment? Well, there are certainly people who believe that my resurrection is important and my relationship to this God is important to my afterlife, my resurrection. So just as Jesus goes through a baptism, like all initiates to Christianity go through baptism, Jesus has to be resurrected because that is, after all, the hope that Christianity is offering the followers. Jesus' own resurrection must be the model. Pick up your own cross and follow me. So what kind of a resurrection can we as Christians expect? And that Jesus is also laying down the model for.
Yeah.
We can't really trust the Gospels on this whole notion, in my view. It's not really historical on the face of it, right? First of all, the Gospels don't even agree about which day Jesus was executed in relation to Passover, right? The Synoptics have it one way, John has it another way. None of this stuff, for example, the trial before Pilate, there's no eyewitnesses to this trial before Pilate. Everyone knows that. Everyone knows that the specific details of the dialogues that are constructed in the Gospels between Jesus and Pilate are fiction. The entire episode of, say, the soldiers gambling, casting lots for Jesus's garments is itself a symbolic representation of the garments of the high priest, the seamless garments of the high priest. We are told by Josephus that during the rebellion, the Jewish rebels cast lots to see who would be high priest. And Jesus's garments are compared to the garments of the high priest as specified in the law. So what we're seeing there is a symbolic representation, a critique of the rebels, in effect, when we see a casting of the lots for Jesus's garments, the holy garments that a high priest should wear. So none of these details from the trial, the execution of Jesus, can be relied upon. And I don't think that the tomb story anymore is reliable than any of those.
And what gets me, James, and you should write another book because you really, I don't know, man. I love, we got to keep doing series at least if you're not going to write another book, because that Creating Christ book.
Oh, I plan to write more books.
I was going to say, and I get where Tom's coming from, and the historicists are like, yeah, but why? It just seems more likely you're going to write this based off of other examples you can make.
Okay, let's go with Tom here.
All right.
If we have a crucified Jesus, who was the base of this, let's go with the hypothesis and grant the hypothesis everything that it's worth here. He was completely turned inside out in terms of his ideology. He was turned into a god when that was probably the last thing that this mortal, rebel, Torah Orthodox Jesus would have ever wanted of himself. He was probably a good monotheist who never even believed that a Messiah would be a divine man. So he's being turned into something he would have not wanted to be turned into. His ideology with respect to Torah is being completely turned inside out. So that if there was a historical Jesus who was crucified, who was the actual basis of all this, he has been turned into the very opposite of the thinking that this person was. Right. And then all this mythologization has taken place, and he's been turned into something altogether different. We've added miraculous stories, we've added nativity stories, we've put words into his mouth, we've given him ritual baptism, a miraculous baptism where God can say, this is my son. We've had him tempted by Satan for 40 days, in a hatched, obviously something no one could have witnessed. Like the prayer in Gethsemane no one listened to, that they all remembered. Obviously the figure in the Gospels is fiction.
Right.
And that's what counts. So at best, at very, very best, let's say there was this historical Jesus. He is utterly unrecognizable except for the basic fact that there was a dude named Jesus who was crucified.
So to make it in dumb terms, this is where I'm going with this. To be fair, to be really, really fair, and I mean, maybe I'm missing something. Maybe more research is needed. You can be a guy who says, we can't really know, but I'm on this side more. I think there's probably a guy. Or you could say, we can't really know, and I'm on the side of, I think there wasn't a guy. That's minimal on both sides. You think the fair position to take is to say minimal, because there's so much stuff. Now,
with a grain of salt on each.
Okay.
The reason why we do not take on this vexed question, this question that's regarded as so important, that historians have spent so much time considering, was there a historical Jesus? What did the real historical Jesus look like? That's really an irrelevant question. Yeah. It is so irrelevant that because whoever this historical Jesus was, he had nothing to do with the Jesus of the New Testament. The Jesus of the New Testament was ideologically his opposite. The Jesus of the New Testament has a life that the real Jesus could not have actually led. A life that has all of these Hebrew scripture elements layered into it, events that are probably just rituals and miracles layered into it. Right? So the character that matters is the Jesus of the New Testament. That is the character that has influenced history. Mm-hmm. Probably the most important single influence in the course of Western history was a person who may or may not have existed, but was this literary figure of the New Testament, Jesus Christ. So if there was a Jesus, what we're saying is he would ideologically have been the opposite. Very little of his actual life has been filtered through into the New Testament, most of which is pure myth and fable. What's left? Does it really much matter? Does it really much matter if there was this historical figure who was exactly the opposite of the Jesus of the Gospels, who didn't go through most of the events, who didn't say most of the things that Jesus is said to have said? Does the question of this historical Jesus much matter once we've determined that most of it is myth? That if he had an ideology, it was the exact opposite of the ideology of the Sermon on the Mount. So the question of historical...
We can pose that off of historical record. We can look at outside sources and say, no, if it walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, and there were no ducks in this area at that time, then this shit is not real in that sense. There's something, and if we could see that there were opposites of ducks, then you could say, hey, but the ducks that are Roman now,
we're like saying, look at this beautiful swan. Was there a goose who really was behind it, because that's what we'd be saying. It wasn't really a swan. Well, it maybe kind of, swam on the water like that,
Right.
but it was totally the opposite. It wasn't a swan at all. It was a goose.
You wouldn't have got away with that kind of stuff. In the areas that Jesus was walking, and they're very, very, in the Gospels, they're pretty specific in saying, and he walked through this, and then he went into Samaria, and then he went into blah, 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 and then he went into da, da, da. In these areas during that time, is this not similar to like walking in the middle of the Middle East, being a Christian, holding a Bible, telling people to come worship Jesus, and ISIS runs rampant around there? What would happen to you?
If there was a Jesus who was preaching anything like what we're told he was preaching in the Gospels, a Jewish crowd would have taken care of him, I think, stoned him. They wouldn't have even waited for the Sanhedrin.
Yeah.
Orthodox Jewish people, who were the majority populations at the time in Galilee and Judea, presumably where Jesus was raised and preaching, right? They would have taken him out. I mean, we see the Jewish crowds who were following Paul and troubling him along the way and trying to get him in trouble all the time. Or the Sanhedrin that goes after St. Stephen in what is probably a mythologized event in the beginning of Acts. Surely the same Jewish opposition. And in fact, the Gospels present it almost that way, don't they? Yes. They have to show Jesus in conflict with the priests, the scribes, the Pharisees. Although that is impossible in my mind, given the debate that's still raging in Galatians. That cannot have been true about Jesus. To make a credible Jesus, even he has to have an argument with the Jewish authorities at the time. But it's not particularly credible to me that someone in this age of Jewish rebellion would go around befriending tax collectors, giving his highest praise to Roman centurions, no less, and would not have faced political opposition among the rebellious Jews of the time. One of these followers of Judas the Galilean, what do you think Judas the Galilean and any of his followers who were active at the time of Jesus would have thought of Jesus?
I mean, bro, if the Jesus is as the Gospels say, there would have probably not been much thought in what they were going to do.
Right. In fact, let's concretize this. We're living in a world of Judas the Galileans who are leading tax rebellions and religious messianic rebellions against Rome in this region. Unless Jesus actually did have Roman protection of some kind, I don't think he would have lasted 5 minutes.
You bring up a good point, James, and let's go with what scholars have said. This movement of Jesus was small, right? It was so small. Well, let's take that. That means there's a small following, a small group of people who could even be a part of this thing. How protected can you be if you're that small and that not important, running around talking the shit that he's talking from the Gospels around guys who are hardcore, Old Testament, Joshua type, every step I take and I'm going to conquer and seriously, it doesn't make sense that he would survive these type of things. Well, duh, Derek, why do you think he was crucified? Now we've got other problems. Crucified for what? They would have stoned him.
Right. They would have stoned him. And they had we know of stonings that occurred in the time of Jesus, and that's how the Sanhedrin could have and would have executed him for violating Mosaic law.
I was going to ask you about
They didn't meet Pilate at all, of course.
No, they really didn't.
Which only adds to the reality that if there was a Jesus who was crucified, he was a rebel, and that's why he was crucified. They have to turn, again, the story has to be turned upside down and inside out, so that if there was a historical Jesus, what we're hearing about him in the New Testament is exactly the opposite of what the reality of a Jesus must have been like if there was a historical Jesus.
Question, before we get to our closeout, because I think it's important that you did a show recently with Jacob Berman and Daniel T. Unterbrink. What were your thoughts of Unterbrink's theory in terms of the show? I'm probably sure you haven't read his book yet, but do you think there's more
I read both of his books on Judas.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. What are your thoughts on his theory?
Books that I've read. There's 2 books on Judas. The thesis itself is what got me to read it. I mean, because as you say, if there was it has long been my position that if there was a historical Jesus, he was a Torah Orthodox rebel who'd been crucified at the time of Pontius Pilate. And that's why a figure like Judas the Galilean is much more credible as a model for Jesus. In other words, if there was a historical Jesus, why do we need a Jesus at all? Why not Judas the Galilean?
Could it?
He
Could
fits
it?
our
Could it
bill.
be? Could it be?
Doesn't he fit our bill?
He does, and
He was
big
a rebel.
enough.
He was
Right.
But
He
again,
was big enough that if you were to make him propaganda, I could see him blowing up. I wouldn't take
right.
a guy named Joe in the middle of nowhere that means nothing. And I mean, could it be a theory that he was nothing and they hung all these ornaments on him? Yeah. Or it could have been this guy was something. Not only do we not want to, have him as that something, we're going to turn him on his head. And this is why he's going to be so popular. We're going to flip somebody like him and make him actually into something completely different.
I have long believed that Judas, the betrayer of Jesus, is an alter ego of Judas the Galilean. We're told that Jesus has, Simon the Zealot. A zealot is one of Jesus' disciples. The name Iscariot, many scholars have said, is a garbled version of Sicarii. And the Zealots and the Sicarii are the two rebel movements. And Jesus apparently has disciples who are rebels, right? And although Judas the Galilean is the direct ancestor of the Zealots and not the Sicarii, both are sort of branches of the rebellion movement that was founded by Judas the Galilean, who started a tax rebellion in the beginning of the first century. We're told in the Gospels, Judas dies the same time Jesus does, and dies, according to some of our New Testament sources, on a tree. This would suggest that an execution of a Judas did take place around the time in question, and that the death of this Judas is maybe the reality that is being keyed off of. It's certainly being keyed off of, I think, with Judas, the betrayer of Jesus, Judas Iscariot. Judas, a Galilean who has this different concept of Messiah and who betrays the real Messiah. So if there was a historical Jesus, it's much more likely that he was a follower of Judas the Galilean. But why do we need that at all? Why don't we just cut out that? And this is where his theory is really fascinating. Why don't we just cut out that step of a rebel follower of Judas the Galilean named Jesus who was executed and just say he was Judas the Galilean reworked?
Right.
That is just as credible in my mind as anything else.
I definitely think this is, we need to do a show. I'd like to do one as well with you and Mr. Unterbrink, and we can delve and probe deeper and really just to see you throw questions back with him and dialogue openly, freely. If you're watching this and you like where we're going with this, please comment what you think. Definitely check out the book, Creating Christ, and tell us what you think of James and give us some questions. I'm sure he'll check it out. James, what does your book offer us pertaining to the New Testament and maybe even pertaining to the question of the existence of Jesus? What would you say your book offers us?
Well, as I say, we don't take a stand on the question of a historical Jesus. We avoid it altogether because we don't think the subject is terribly relevant.
But if Dr. Bob is saying that it comes so close to, what do you think?
Well, I think that we do have to acknowledge that the literature of the New Testament is not only taking a theological position, but a political position, an overwhelming political position, a pro-Roman position, a pro-peace position, a pro-tax position, a pro-submission position, a position, a highly Hellenized philosophical one that would have probably been antithetical to the Jewish rebels as well. The New Testament represents a critical response to the Jewish rebels, the messianic, Torah orthodox, nationalist, militant rebels of the first 2 centuries. There's no question in my mind that has got to be our fundamental understanding of what the New Testament is, and I think that's what Creating Christ offers fundamentally. Whether or not our specific thesis is correct or not, that the Flavians and Nero before him were basically responsible for creating a counter propaganda, and that this emanated from the Roman state itself, for which I think there is all kinds of powerful evidence. I think it is undeniable that at the very least, the New Testament represents a direct reaction to the rebellion ideology so popular among first century Jews. on the face of it.
Ladies and gentlemen, you heard it best. James Stevens, Valliant. Thank you for joining me, my brother. And how can they contact you?
Well, we got a website, www.creatingchrist.com. I'm very active on Facebook, where we have a Creating Christ page, and we also have a Roman Providence of Christianity page. I'm at Facebook just about every single day. They can contact me there. They can get our book in every single format: hardback, quality paperback, audio version, electronic version, Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com. Perfect gift for the holidays.
Good point. Good point. And when I read it, it was a great book. I definitely recommend it, and I suggest it. Thanks for watching and supporting this channel with MythVision. If you like what you're hearing, help us out. Make sure you go down in the description, show us a little love, or as Dr. Luther says, a little warm and fuzzy. I love you guys. Your host, Derek Lambert. We are MythVision.